June 4th, 1942, just 630 hours, 175 miles northwest of Midway Atoll. The morning sun glinted off the canopy of Marine Captain Philip White's Brewster F2A Buffalo as he led VMF 221's fighter section toward an approaching formation that looked like a swarm of locusts darkening the horizon. White, 28 years old, a career Marine who had never fired his guns in anger, keyed his radio transmitter. Tally-ho! Many bandits, 11 o'clock high. Below him, spread across 30 miles of Pacific Ocean, 108 Japanese carrier aircraft were beginning their attack run on Midway Atoll. Escorting them, gleaming in the dawn light like silver daggers, were 36 Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighters. The pilots flying those Zeros were veterans of Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and the Indian Ocean. They had destroyed over 500 Allied aircraft in 6 months of nearly uninterrupted victory. They were about to meet the Brewster Buffalo, an aircraft so obsolete that one Navy test pilot had described it as a flying coffin with good visibility. What happened in the next 20 minutes would become one of the most one-sided aerial slaughters in military history. Of the 25 Buffaloes and Wildcats that intercepted the Japanese strike force that morning, 17 would be shot down. 13 Marine pilots would die. 2 would be so badly wounded they would never fly again. Of the aircraft that survived, not one returned undamaged. The Buffalo, already obsolete before Pearl Harbor, would prove so catastrophically inferior to the Zero that within weeks the type would be withdrawn from frontline service forever. This is the story of how American industrial mismanagement, bureaucratic incompetence, and doctrinal blindness sent young men to fight in aircraft that were little better than target practice. It's the story of courage wasted by criminal negligence, of pilots who knew they were flying death traps but climbed into them anyway. And it's the story of how the worst fighter aircraft America ever put into combat met the best fighter Japan would ever produce and disintegrated. The Brewster Buffalo began not as a failure but as hope. In 1936, when the Navy issued a requirement for a carrier-based monoplane fighter to replace the biplane Grumman F-3 Eve, it represented the service's first acknowledgement that aviation technology had fundamentally changed. The specifications called for a top speed of 250 miles per hour, a service ceiling of 20,000 feet, and a landing speed low enough for carrier operations. Brewster Aeronautical Corporation, a small company in Queens, New York, submitted a radical design. The XF2A-1 featured a mid-wing monoplane configuration, retractable landing gear, an enclosed cockpit, and a Wright R1820 Cyclone engine producing 950 horsepower. When it flew on December 2, 1937, it represented the cutting edge of American fighter design. Test pilots loved it. Lieutenant Commander William Davis, the Navy's chief test pilot, reported that it handled beautifully, had excellent visibility, and outperformed everything else in the Navy inventory. On June 11, 1938, the Navy ordered 54 production F2A-1 Buffaloes. For a brief moment, Brewster Aeronautical was building America's premier naval fighter. Then, everything went wrong. The problems began with success. The export orders arrived before Brewster had established proper production capabilities. Finland ordered 44 Buffaloes in 1939. Belgium ordered 40. Britain ordered 170. The Netherlands East Indies ordered 72. Suddenly, a company that had never mass-produced aircraft was supposed to deliver over 300 fighters while simultaneously establishing production lines, training workers, and maintaining quality control. They failed at all three. The Brewster factory became a case study in industrial dysfunction. Workers had inadequate training. Supervisors had no experience in aircraft production. Quality control was non-existent. Components arrived from subcontractors that didn't fit. Electrical systems were wired incorrectly. Fuel tanks leaked. Engine mounts cracked. The company's management, more interested in profit than product, cut corners everywhere possible. They used substandard materials, simplified manufacturing processes in ways that compromised structural integrity, and shipped aircraft they knew were defective. By 1940, Brewster had become infamous in naval aviation circles. Delivery dates were routinely missed by months. Aircraft arrived with hundreds of defects requiring extensive rework. Performance specifications that had been met by prototypes mysteriously degraded in production models. The Navy began investigating Brewster for fraud and mismanagement, even as they continued ordering aircraft because no alternatives existed. But the real problem wasn't just Brewster's incompetence. It was that aircraft technology was advancing faster than American industry could keep up, and the Buffalo was being left behind. Each new production variant added weight. The F2A1 weighed 4,130 pounds empty. The F2A2, with additional fuel tankage and a more powerful engine, weighed 4,138 pounds. The F2A3, the final production variant, weighed 5,270 pounds empty, a 14% increase over the original. Meanwhile, engine power increased only marginally. The result was catastrophic degradation in performance. The XF2A1 prototype had achieved 304 miles per hour in level flight and could climb to 20,000 feet in 7.1 minutes. The F2A3, burdened with additional armour, self-sealing fuel tanks and heavier armament, could barely reach 321 miles per hour at altitude and required 11 minutes to reach 20,000 feet. The rate of climb, crucial for intercepting enemy aircraft, had been cut nearly in half. The aircraft's handling characteristics had degraded equally. Early Buffaloes were reportedly delightful to fly, responsive and forgiving. The F2A3 was nose-heavy, sluggish in roll, and had a tendency to snap into spins during hard manoeuvring. Pilots reported that the controls felt mushy, that pulling high G turns resulted in frighteningly low speeds, and that recovering from dives required muscle-straining effort on the stick. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Flatley, one of the Navy's most experienced fighter pilots, flew an F2A3 at Ennas North Island in early 1942 and submitted a scathing report. This aircraft is inferior to the A6M Zero in every performance parameter, except diving speed. It cannot climb with the Zero, cannot turn with the Zero, and at combat weights cannot outrun the Zero in level flight. The armour protection is inadequate. The fuel tanks, while self-sealing, are too small for extended combat air patrol. The armament of 450 caliber machine guns is acceptable, but the limited ammunition capacity of 200 rounds per gun means sustained combat is impossible. I would not want to meet a Zero in this aircraft. The men of VMF 221 would have no choice. Marine Fighting Squadron 221 arrived at Midway Atoll on December 21, 1941, 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor. They flew a mixed collection of 21 Brewster F2A3 Buffaloes and 7 Grumman F4F3 Wildcats, the sum total of marine air defense for the most strategically important outpost in the Central Pacific. The squadron's commanding officer was Major Floyd Parks, a 33-year-old career Marine and Naval Academy graduate who had been flying fighters for 6 years. Parks was experienced, competent, and under no illusions about his aircraft. He had read the intelligence reports on the Zero. He knew what his men would face. In May 1942, Parks submitted a request to Marine Air Group 22 headquarters, asking for replacement aircraft. The F2A3 is not satisfactory and should not be used for combat operations, he wrote. Request immediate replacement with F4F4 Wildcats or any other fighter type with performance adequate for combat against Japanese Zero fighters. The request was denied. There were no spare Wildcats. The Buffalo would have to do. Parks began preparing his men for the inevitable. He organised intensive combat training, emphasising altitude advantage, hit-and-run tactics, and never engaging Zeros in turning fights. He drilled his pilots on emergency procedures, on fighting with damaged aircraft, on survival if shot down at sea. He instituted physical fitness training to help pilots endure the high G-forces of combat manoeuvring. He did everything possible to compensate for flying an inferior aircraft. It wouldn't be enough. On June 3, 1942, a Navy PBY Catalina flying patrol detected the Japanese carrier strike force approaching Midway from the northwest. Admiral Chester Nimitz's intelligence staff had predicted the attack to within 24 hours. The Americans knew it was coming. They were as ready as limited resources allowed. At 5:30 on June 4th, radar detected the incoming Japanese strike 93 miles out. Every available aircraft on Midway scrambled. The torpedo bombers and dive bombers headed out to attack the Japanese carriers. VMF 221's fighters, 25 aircraft total, climbed to intercept the incoming raid. Major Parks led 12 Buffaloes as high cover at 17,000 feet. Captain Kirk Armistead led another section of 7 Buffaloes at 14,000 feet. Captain Marion Carl led the 6 Wildcats at 12,000 feet. The plan was simple. The Wildcats would hit the Japanese bombers from below. The Buffaloes would engage any escorting fighters from altitude. At 06-116, the formation spotted each other. Captain Philip White, leading the forward section of Buffaloes, saw the Japanese formation spread across the sky like a deadly parade. 96 Valdive bombers and Kate torpedo bombers in tight formation, their aluminum skins glittering in the morning sun. Above them, stepped up in a perfect defensive formation, were the Zeros. White counted 36 of them. The Japanese escort commander was Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya, a Pearl Harbor veteran with 9 kills and hundreds of hours in the Zero. Itaya saw the American fighters climbing to intercept and smiled. The Americans were badly outnumbered, obviously outclassed, and committing the fundamental error of meeting his formation head-on, where his numerical advantage would be decisive. He waggled his wings and 12 Zeros peeled off to meet the threat. The American pilots saw them coming. In the lead Buffalo, Captain White pushed his throttle to maximum power and hauled back on the stick, trying to gain every possible foot of altitude before the merge. The Wright Cyclone engine, already straining at 14,000 feet, bellowed protest. The Buffalo climbed at barely 1,000 feet per minute, painfully slow. The Zeros, lighter and more powerful, climbed toward them at over 3,000 feet per minute. Second Lieutenant Clayton Canfield, flying wing on White, later recalled the moment. They came up at us like they were riding an elevator, and we were climbing stairs. I pushed everything forward, full throttle, full RPM, and they still climbed right through us like we were standing still. I saw the leader's Zero pass within 100 feet, going straight up. He looked over at me. I could see his face clearly. He wasn't even trying yet. The Zeros reached altitude advantage in seconds and rolled into their attack. What happened next was described by survivors as organized slaughter. The Zero was possibly the finest air combat fighter of its era. Designed by Jiro Horikoshi at Mitsubishi, it represented the absolute peak of lightweight fighter philosophy. Empty weight of only 3,704 pounds. A Nakajima Sakai engine producing 940 horsepower, giving it a power-to-weight ratio that no Allied fighter could match. A maximum speed of 331 miles per hour at 15,000 feet. Most importantly, it could turn inside anything in the sky. The Zero's legendary maneuverability came from radical design choices. No armor protection for the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks, minimal structure, with components machined to the absolute minimum thickness. The wings used an aluminum alloy so thin in places that mechanics could push a finger through it if they pressed hard. Every ounce of unnecessary weight had been eliminated in pursuit of performance. The result was an aircraft that could outturn, outclimb, and out-accelerate nearly anything it fought. In the hands of experienced pilots, and in June 1942 all Japanese carrier pilots were experienced, it was absolutely deadly. Lieutenant Commander Itaya's Zeros hit the Buffalo formation with textbook precision. 4 Zeros engaged head-on, their 20mm cannon and 2 7.7mm machine guns opening fire at 600 yards. The other 8 split into 4 pairs, each pair selecting a Buffalo and executing a high-side pass that put them on the American aircraft's tail with a 100-mile-per-hour speed advantage. Captain White saw tracers flash past his canopy and instinctively pulled into a hard climbing turn to the right. The Buffalo responded sluggishly. At 15,000 feet, at combat weight, the F2A3 needed over 3 seconds to roll 90 degrees. The Zero pursuing him rolled in half that time. White pulled harder, hauling the stick into his lap, feeling the G-forces crushing him into his seat. The Buffalo shuddered, the wings flexing visibly. The airspeed dropped from 280 miles per hour to 190 to 160. The stall warning buffet shook the airframe. He eased off slightly. The Zero behind him had no such limitations. At speeds where the Buffalo was approaching stall, the Zero could still turn. The Japanese pilot, probably one of Itaya's section leaders, had over 1,000 hours in the Zero and 200 hours of combat experience. He placed his illuminated gunsight pipper on the Buffalo's fuselage and pressed the firing button. The Zero's armament was devastating at close range. 2 7.7mm machine guns firing through the propeller arc, each with 500 rounds. 2 20mm Type 99 cannon in the wings, each with 60 rounds of explosive shells. The cannon shells were designed to explode on contact, doing maximum damage to lightly built aircraft. They worked exactly as designed against the Buffalo. Captain White's aircraft absorbed 4 20-meter hits in 3 seconds. 1 shell exploded in the engine cowling, severing the oil cooler lines. Hot oil sprayed across the windscreen, instantly reducing visibility to 0. Another shell detonated in the right wing root, blowing a hole 2 feet across and severing the aileron control cables. The third hit the fuselage just behind the cockpit, the explosion shredding hydraulic lines and electrical cables. The fourth shell went through the tail section without exploding, but the damage was done. White's Buffalo, built to inferior standards by undertrained workers using substandard materials, essentially came apart. The wing began folding upward, metal screaming. The engine seized, the propeller freezing in place. The entire aircraft shuddered like a living thing in its death throes. White, covered in oil and unable to see, made the only possible decision. He jettisoned the canopy and bailed out. At 14,000 feet, he was one of the lucky ones. He would survive. To tell the story, his wingman, Second Lieutenant Clayton Canfield, watched White's aircraft disintegrate and immediately tried to dive away. The Buffalo, whatever its many flaws, could dive. The heavy wing loading and solid construction meant it could reach high speeds in a dive without structural failure. Canfield pushed the stick forward and rolled inverted, a classic escape maneuver that should have given him a speed advantage. But he made the fatal mistake of diving away from the Zeros in a straight line. The Zero's fundamental weakness was dive performance. The lightweight construction and large wing area meant it could not dive as fast as heavier fighters. But at the start of a dive, it had a crucial advantage. It could follow the dive entry, maintaining position for several crucial seconds, while the heavier fighter accelerated. 2 Zeros followed Canfield's dive entry and opened fire before his speed built up. The 20mm cannon shells walked up the Buffalo's fuselage from tail to cockpit. One exploded in the cockpit itself, the shrapnel shredding Canfield's right arm and side. The Buffalo, now uncontrolled with its pilot incapacitated, rolled to the right and entered a spiral dive from which it never recovered. It impacted the ocean at over 400 miles per hour, the impact force pulverizing aircraft and pilot into fragments. The entire engagement from first contact to Canfield's death had taken 90 seconds. Captain Kirk Armistead's section, flying at 14,000 feet, saw the Zeros massacre the high cover and made the gutsy decision to attack anyway. Armistead, a 26-year-old Texan who had been flying fighters for 3 years, knew the Buffalo's limitations intimately. His only hope was to use the one advantage the Buffalo had, firepower, and get out before the Zeros could respond. He rolled his section into a near-vertical dive, aiming for the Japanese bomber formation below. At full throttle in a dive, the Buffalo could reach 450 miles per hour, fast enough that the Zeros above couldn't catch him before he reached the bombers. But Armistead had forgotten about the Zeros flying escort directly with the bomber formation. Lieutenant Masayuki Nakao, flying close escort on the Kate torpedo bombers, saw the Buffaloes diving and calmly turned to intercept. Nakao was a Pearl Harbor veteran with 6 kills. He had shot down 2 P-40s over Hawaii, 3 Hurricanes over Ceylon, and a Dutch Brewster Buffalo over Java. He knew exactly how to kill the F2A3. He rolled inverted and pulled his Zero into a climbing barrel roll that intercepted Armistead's dive angle. As Armistead's Buffalo flashed past at 400 miles per hour, Nakao fired a single burst from his 20mm cannon at deflection, leading the target by 50 feet. It was a difficult shot requiring perfect calculation of relative velocities and trajectories. Nakao had practiced it hundreds of times. 3 20mm shells hit Armistead's Buffalo in the left wing. The wing, already stressed by the high-speed dive, simply failed. The entire outer wing panel separated from the aircraft, tumbling away. The Buffalo, now grossly asymmetrical, rolled violently to the left and came apart from the aerodynamic forces. Armistead died instantly when the cockpit section separated from the fuselage. His body was never recovered. Second Lieutenant George Lumpkin, flying as Armistead's wingman, saw his commander's aircraft disintegrate and reacted with pure instinct. He hauled back on the stick, converting his dive speed into a climbing zoom that carried him back to 16,000 feet. It was the right move, the only move that could have saved him. But the Buffalo's power-to-weight ratio betrayed him. At the top of the zoom, his airspeed had dropped to barely 120 miles per hour, just above stall speed. He hung there for a moment, suspended in the sky, a perfect target. 2 Zeros that had been pursuing his dive had lost him when he zoomed, but they hadn't lost sight of him. They pulled into vertical climbs of their own, their superior power-to-weight ratio allowing them to maintain nearly 200 miles per hour even in a vertical climb. They reached Lumpkin's altitude with 80 miles per hour of speed advantage. Lumpkin never had a chance. The first Zero opened fire at 200 yards, nearly point-blank range for aircraft combat. The 20mm shells shredded the Buffalo's tail section, blowing away the elevators and rudder. The aircraft pitched forward into an uncontrollable dive. The second Zero fired into the exposed belly as the Buffalo fell past, the shells detonating in the fuel tanks. The explosion was visible from Midway 30 miles away, a brief orange flower in the morning sky. By 06:20, 4 minutes into the engagement, VMF 221 had lost 6 Buffaloes. 6 more were damaged, their pilots fighting controls that barely responded, engines that were overheating, hydraulic systems that had failed. The Marines had achieved nothing. Not one Japanese bomber had been damaged. The Zero pilots were hunting systematically, working in pairs, each pair selecting a Buffalo and executing coordinated attacks that the American pilots had no defense against. Captain Marion Carl's Wildcat section, flying at 12,000 feet, made the wise decision not to engage the Zeros. Carl, who would end the war with 18.5 kills and become a legendary Marine aviator, recognized a hopeless situation when he saw one. Instead of climbing to engage fighters, he led his Wildcats into the Japanese bomber formation from below, using their superior armor and firepower to engage softer targets. The Wildcat was a better aircraft than the Buffalo in every measurable way. It was slower than the Zero, less maneuverable than the Zero, but it was rugged. It could absorb tremendous damage and keep flying. Its 650 caliber machine guns, while carrying limited ammunition, could destroy enemy aircraft with short bursts. Most importantly, its pilots were trained to use its strengths. Carl's Wildcats hit the Kate formation from below, each fighter selecting a bomber and opening fire at 300 yards. The Kates, unarmoured and carrying tons of fuel and explosives, were vulnerable. 2 were shot down immediately, tumbling into the ocean in flames. A third was damaged, trailing smoke as its pilots struggled to maintain formation. But the Zero escorts reacted immediately. 8 Zeros dove on the Wildcats, and now the Marines faced the same impossible calculus that the Buffalo pilots had discovered. The Wildcat was tougher than the Buffalo, more reliable than the Buffalo, but it was still significantly inferior to the Zero in performance. Carl's pilots survived the initial engagement only because the Wildcat could absorb damage. Second Lieutenant Charles Hughes took 3 20mm hits in the wings and 1 in the tail and kept flying. Ensign Eugene Card's Wildcat was hit 8 times by 7.7mm machine gun fire, the bullets punching through the wings and fuselage without hitting anything critical. The self-sealing fuel tanks, which the Buffalo also had but which were less reliable due to Brewster's quality control issues, prevented fires. But the Wildcats couldn't fight effectively. Every time they tried to engage the bombers, Zeros would attack from above. Every time they tried to engage the Zeros, the Japanese fighters would turn inside them effortlessly. Carl, recognizing the futility, ordered his section to disengage and return to base. 4 of his 6 Wildcats made it back. Both of the missing pilots were recovered from the ocean, wounded but alive. The Buffaloes had no such option. Major Parks, the squadron commander, was still aloft with 5 other Buffaloes, trying desperately to find an angle of attack that would work. Parks was an experienced pilot and a capable tactician, but he was trying to solve an unsolvable problem. His aircraft was inferior in speed, climb, maneuverability and dive performance below 20,000 feet. His pilots were outnumbered 3-1. The enemy pilots had 6 months of combat experience. It was an equation with only one answer. Parks tried the boom and zoom tactic, diving from above on the bomber formation, firing a quick burst and diving away before the Zeros could react. It worked once. His burst caught a Val dive bomber in the engine, the 50 caliber rounds tearing through the air-cooled radial and causing it to seize. The Val fell out of formation, trailing smoke, but the Zeros had learned. The next time Parks tried the tactic, 2 Zeros were waiting along his dive path, having predicted his attack based on geometry and relative positions. They fired at him head-on as he dove past, and 1 20mm shell hit his Buffalo's engine. The right cyclone didn't explode, didn't seize, it just lost power. The propeller kept turning, but the engine was producing maybe 400 horsepower instead of 200. Parks immediately nosed down into a dive toward the ocean, trying to build speed for the run back to Midway. But a Zero pilot, probably one of Itaya's section leaders, followed him down. The chase lasted 8 minutes. Parks flying a damaged aircraft, nursing his dying engine, using every trick he had learned in 6 years of flying fighters. The Zero pilot behind him, methodical and patient, waiting for the perfect shot. At 4,000 feet, Parks tried one final maneuver. He chopped the throttle and extended his landing gear, trying to force an overshoot. The massive drag from the landing gear slowed the Buffalo dramatically. Any aircraft behind him travelling at combat speed would have shot past, unable to slow in time. The Zero pilot didn't overshoot. He simply pulled into a vertical climb, bleeding off speed, rolled inverted at the top, and came down on Parks from above. The final burst hit the Buffalo's cockpit. Major Floyd Parks, Squadron Commander, Naval Academy graduate, career Marine, died at 6:34 on June 4, 1942, shot down within sight of Midway Atoll. His body was found still strapped in the cockpit when the aircraft was recovered from shallow water 3 days later. By Osho 6:35, the engagement was effectively over. VMF 221 had lost 13 Buffaloes destroyed and 4 damaged beyond immediate repair. Of the squadron's 25 fighters, only 8 returned to base undamaged. 13 pilots were dead. 2 were badly wounded. The squadron had shot down 1 confirmed Val dive bomber, possibly 2, and damaged 2 more. Against this, the Japanese had lost exactly 0 zeros. The Japanese bombers proceeded to attack Midway Atoll, destroying fuel tanks, hangars, and support facilities. But the attack was not decisive. The airstrips remained operational. American aircraft could still launch counterattacks, and launch they did, with devastating results. The torpedo bombers and dive bombers that struck the Japanese carriers later that morning would sink 4 fleet carriers and change the course of the Pacific War. But VMF 221's sacrifice bought crucial time. The Japanese strike had been delayed, disrupted, forced to deal with fighter opposition, even though that opposition was ineffective. Minutes matter in naval aviation. The minutes the Buffaloes bought may have made the difference. After the battle, the surviving pilots of VMF 221 were debriefed by Navy intelligence officers trying to understand what had happened. Lieutenant Clayton Canfield, who had bailed out after his Buffalo was shot to pieces, submitted a written report that was classified for the duration of the war. The F2A Buffalo is hopelessly outclassed by the Japanese Zero fighter, he wrote. It is inferior in speed, climb, maneuverability, and dive performance below 20,000 feet. The only advantage is that it can dive faster at high altitudes, but reaching those altitudes under combat conditions is impossible. The armament of 4 50 caliber machine guns is adequate, but the ammunition capacity is insufficient for sustained combat. The armor protection, while better than nothing, is inadequate against 20 mm cannon fire. The aircraft's handling characteristics at combat weights are unacceptable. Stall speed is too high, roll rate is too slow, and pitch control requires excessive force. Several pilots reported being unable to pull out of high-speed dives without using both hands on the stick. My recommendation is immediate withdrawal of the F2A from combat operations. Any other action would be criminal negligence resulting in unnecessary loss of life. The Navy agreed. Within 6 weeks, every F2A was withdrawn from frontline squadrons in the Pacific. Most were sent to training units in the United States where they promptly killed more pilots in accidents. Some were shipped to relief stations in the Caribbean. A few were used as ground trainers. Not a single Buffalo ever flew combat in the Pacific again after June 1942. The historical debate about the Buffalo has always focused on a simple question. Was it a bad design or bad implementation? The answer is both. The original XF2A1 was a good design. Test pilots loved it. Performance was exceptional for 1937. But Brewster's criminally incompetent production processes turned a promising fighter into a death trap. Every production variant was heavier, slower, and less reliable than the one before. Quality control was non-existent. Aircraft arrived with defects that should never have passed inspection. Structural components failed in flight. Fuel systems leaked. Electrical systems caught fire. In parallel, the design was allowed to become obsolete. Between 1938 and 1942, fighter performance improved dramatically. The British Spitfire gained over 100 horsepower and 40 miles per hour. The German Messerschmitt Bf-109 went through 4 major variants, each significantly faster and better armed. The Japanese Zero entered service with performance that exceeded anything flying in 1939. The Buffalo received minor updates, added weight, and progressively degraded performance. By 1942, it was flying against fighters that were generationally superior. But the real crime was that everyone knew. The Navy knew the Buffalo was obsolete. Intelligence reports on the Zero's performance had been available since the fall of 1941. Test pilots like Jimmy Flatley had filed reports saying the Buffalo was inferior, but there were no alternatives. The Wildcat was in short supply. The Corsair was still in development. Someone had to fly the Buffaloes, and that someone was VMF-221. The legacy of the Buffalo is complicated. In Finnish service, flying against inferior Soviet fighters in 1939 and 1940, Buffaloes achieved an impressive kill ratio. Finnish pilots loved the aircraft and achieved over 450 kills for the loss of only 19 Buffaloes in combat. But the Finnish Buffaloes were early production models, lighter and faster than the F2A3, and they were fighting I-15s and early model I-16s, aircraft that were themselves obsolete. When Finland faced modern Soviet fighters like the Yak-1 and Leiji-G3 in 1942, Buffalo losses increased dramatically. The Commonwealth air forces that flew Buffaloes against the Japanese in Malaya and Singapore in 1941 and 1942 fared no better than the Marines. RAF and RAF squadrons equipped with Buffaloes were slaughtered. The type was withdrawn from combat operations in the Far East by March 1942, with terrible loss ratios. The pilots called it the flying coffin. At the Battle of Midway, the Buffalo's inadequacy was laid bare in the most dramatic possible fashion. In 20 minutes of combat, more than half the squadron was destroyed. Against an enemy that fought intelligently and had superior equipment, the Buffalo was helpless. The men who flew them knew this. They flew anyway. That is the real story of the Buffalo. Not that it was a bad aircraft, though it was. Not that it was poorly built, though it was. But that men climbed into aircraft they knew were obsolete, aircraft they knew were death traps, and flew into combat anyway because someone had to. Second Lieutenant Charles Summers survived the Battle of Midway. His Buffalo had been shot to pieces, the engine failing, the hydraulics gone, half the tail section blown away. He managed to land it on Midway's runway despite having no flaps and only partial elevator control. The aircraft was surveyed and declared a total loss. Summers walked away with minor injuries. 30 years later, in an interview for a military history journal, he was asked about the Buffalo. His answer was quiet, measured, and devastating. It was a terrible airplane, he said. Slow, clumsy, poorly built, obsolete before we ever got them. We all knew it. Parks knew it. Everybody knew it. But we were Marines, and we flew what they gave us. I watched good men die in those airplanes, men who might have survived in Wildcats or Corsairs. But we didn't have those. We had Buffaloes. So we climbed in, and we fought. That's what you do. I don't blame the aircraft. I blame the system that put us in them. The Buffalo was withdrawn from US service in 1942. A few lingered in training roles until 1943, killing trainee pilots in accidents. The last Buffalo was scrapped in 1945. No complete example survives today. Only a handful of wrecks recovered from crash sites, most too damaged to restore. But the legacy survives in the memories of the men who flew them and the families of those who died in them. At the Marine Corps Museum in Quantico, Virginia, there is a small exhibit about VMF-221. It includes a photograph of the squadron taken in May 1942. 25 young men in flight suits standing in front of their Buffaloes. 13 of those men were dead within a month. The placard below the photograph includes a quote from Captain Marion Carl, who survived the battle and the war. "We flew obsolete aircraft against superior opposition, and we paid for it in blood," he said. "The Buffalo wasn't beaten. It was never competitive. The real tragedy is that we knew this before the battle and sent men into combat anyway. That is a sin that can never be forgiven." The day the Buffalo met the Zero at Midway, it didn't just lose, it disintegrated. And with it disintegrated any illusions that American industry and military procurement had adequately prepared the nation for modern war. The lessons learned in Blood over Midway would drive the development of the Hellcat, the Corsair, and the other aircraft that would eventually win air superiority over the Pacific. But those lessons came too late for the 13 Marines who died on June 4, 1942, flying aircraft that never should have been in combat. The Buffalo's epitaph was written by one of its victims. Second Lieutenant William Brooks, shot down and killed during the battle, had written a letter to his parents 2 weeks earlier. "We know what we're flying isn't good enough," he wrote. "We know what's waiting for us, but we're Marines. We'll do our duty. If I don't come back, don't be sad. I died doing what I was trained to do. Just remember that someone sent me to do this job in an aircraft that wasn't adequate. Remember that." The Buffalo met the Zero. It disintegrated, and 13 young men died because American industry and military leadership failed them. That is the true story of the Brewster Buffalo at Midway. The investigation into what happened over Midway began within days of the battle. Navy Department analysts pored over combat reports, interviewed survivors, examined recovered wreckage, and tried to understand how an entire fighter squadron had been nearly annihilated in 20 minutes. What they discovered went far beyond simple equipment inadequacy. It revealed systematic failures in procurement, training, doctrine, and industrial oversight that had been building since before Pearl Harbor. The Buffalo's development history read like a textbook case of how not to manage military aviation programs. When the Navy accepted the F2A prototype in 1938, they were getting an aircraft that represented the state of the art. But between prototype acceptance and operational deployment, 4 years elapsed. 4 years during which aviation technology advanced at unprecedented speed, driven by war in Europe and Asia. The Navy's procurement process, designed for the leisurely pace of peacetime development, could not adapt. Brewster Aeronautical Corporation's problems went beyond mere incompetence. A 1942 investigation by the Truman Committee, a Senate body examining defense contractor fraud, uncovered systematic corruption. Company executives had awarded lucrative subcontracts to firms they had financial interests in. Materials were purchased at inflated prices. Workers were paid for overtime they hadn't worked. Quality inspectors were pressured to approve defective components. The company's president, James Work, was more concerned with stock price than aircraft quality. When Navy inspectors rejected aircraft for defects, Work would complain to his political contacts in Congress, who would pressure the Navy to accept the aircraft. This happened repeatedly throughout 1940 and 1941. Aircraft that should have been rejected were instead delivered to operational squadrons. Some of these aircraft were the ones VMF 221 flew at Midway. Lieutenant Charles Summers' Buffalo, the one that was shot to pieces but landed safely, was examined in detail after the battle. What engineers found was shocking. The main spar, the primary structural member that carries wing loads, had been manufactured with incorrect heat treatment. It was 30% weaker than specifications required. The wing attach bolts were installed with insufficient torque and no safety wire. Under high G loads, they could have backed out, causing wing separation. The fuel tank seams were sealed with a compound that degraded when exposed to aviation gasoline, causing leaks. 3 of the 4 main longerons in the fuselage were misaligned during assembly, creating stress concentrations, and the electrical wiring, supposed to be installed in protective conduits, was instead zip-tied directly to the airframe where it could chafe through and short-circuit. This wasn't one defective aircraft. This was systematic, company-wide manufacturing failure. Every Buffalo that flew at Midway had similar defects. The miracle wasn't that so many were shot down. The miracle was that any of them flew at all. The Navy's response was immediate and comprehensive. Brewster Aeronautical was placed under direct Navy supervision in July 1942. Company executives were removed. New management was installed. Quality control procedures were completely rewritten. But it was too late for the Buffalo. The design was obsolete, the reputation destroyed. The company would build other aircraft under license, including F-3A Corsairs and SBN Buccaneer dive bombers, but would never recover. Brewster Aeronautical was liquidated in 1946, its assets sold for pennies on the dollar. But the Navy's own role in the Buffalo disaster could not be ignored. Warning signs had been abundant. Test pilots had filed negative reports. Fleet squadrons had complained about performance and reliability. Intelligence reports on Japanese fighter capabilities were available months before Midway. Yet VMF 221 was sent into combat with no alternatives, no backup plan, and inadequate preparation for what they would face. Captain Marion Carl, in his post-battle debriefing, was asked why the Marine pilots had not been informed about Zero performance before the battle. His response was bitter. "We were told the Japanese couldn't build good aircraft. We were told their pilots were poorly trained and nearsighted. We were told our equipment was adequate. Every single thing we were told was a lie or wishful thinking. When we saw those Zeros climb and turn, we realized we'd been set up to die by people who either didn't know or didn't care about the truth. The institutional racism and underestimation of Japanese capabilities had infected American military thinking at every level. Pre-war intelligence assessments consistently described Japanese aircraft as inferior copies of Western designs. Japanese pilots were characterized as imitative rather than innovative, capable of flying straight and level, but unable to handle complex combat maneuvering. These assessments were based on obsolete information, cultural prejudice, and wishful thinking. They were also completely wrong. The Zero was not an inferior copy. It was an original design that had made different trade-offs than Western fighters. It sacrificed pilot protection and fuel tank integrity for performance. In 1942, with experienced pilots, this was the correct choice. Japanese naval aviators underwent the most rigorous training program in the world. Pilot candidates began training in their mid-teens. The washout rate exceeded 90%. Those who graduated had over 700 hours of flight time before joining operational squadrons. By comparison, American naval aviators in 1942 were receiving 300 hours of training. The Japanese pilots at Midway averaged over 800 hours in type. Some had over 2,000 hours. They were the best-trained, most experienced fighter pilots in the world, flying the best carrier fighter in the world. VMF-221 never had a chance. The tactical lessons from Midway were absorbed quickly. Within weeks, new fighter tactics were being taught at the Navy's fighter school in Jacksonville, Florida. Never turn with a Zero, never climb with a Zero at low altitude, use altitude advantage and diving speed, fight in pairs with mutual support. If bounced, dive immediately and extend, using superior diving speed and rugged construction to escape. These tactics, formalized as the Thatch Weave by Commander John Thatch, would become standard for all Navy and Marine fighter pilots. They worked. When properly executed by trained pilots in capable aircraft, American fighters could engage Zeros on favorable terms, but they required aircraft with adequate performance. The Buffalo did not qualify. Its diving speed advantage was marginal. Its climb rate was inadequate to regain altitude after diving attacks. Its turn rate, while poor, tempted pilots into turning engagements where they had no chance. The Wildcat, while still inferior to the Zero in most performance parameters, was adequate. The Hellcat, which would enter service in 1943, was superior. But in June 1942, the Marines at Midway flew Buffaloes because nothing else was available. The cost was measured in young lives. Second Lieutenant George Toms was 22 years old when he died over Midway. He had graduated from flight school 3 months earlier with 285 hours total flight time. He had 47 hours in the Buffalo. He had never fired his guns in combat. His aircraft was shot down in the first 2 minutes of the engagement. His body was never recovered. He had written a letter to his girlfriend the night before the battle. It was found in his footlocker and forwarded to his family. "Tomorrow might be the day," he wrote. "We know the Japanese are coming. We know what they're flying. We know what we're flying. The math doesn't look good. But we're Marines. We don't get to choose our equipment. We get to choose whether we do our duty. I choose yes. If something happens, know that I wasn't afraid. Well, maybe a little afraid. But I went anyway. That has to count for something." The families of the pilots killed at Midway would not learn the full truth for years. Initial casualty notifications listed the men as killed in action against superior enemy forces. True, but incomplete. It would be decades before the full story of the Buffalo's inadequacy and Brewster's corruption became public. Some families felt betrayed. Their sons, brothers, and husbands had been sent to fight in aircraft that were essentially defective, built by a corrupt company, approved by negligent inspectors, and deployed despite warnings from those who knew better. Other families took a different view. Their loved ones had done their duty with the equipment provided. They had fought with courage against overwhelming odds. The failure was not theirs. It belonged to the system that sent them to fight in inadequate aircraft. Both views were correct. The Battle of Midway was an American strategic victory. The destruction of 4 Japanese fleet carriers changed the balance of power in the Pacific. Japan would never again achieve naval superiority. The American triumph at Midway is rightly celebrated as the turning point of the Pacific War. But for VMF-221, Midway was a catastrophe, a massacre, a preventable tragedy that highlighted every flaw in American procurement, training, and leadership. In August 1942, the Navy held a classified conference at Nass Anacostia to discuss fighter tactics and equipment. Every fighter squadron commander in the Atlantic and Pacific was invited. Commander John Thatch presented his weave tactic. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Flatley discussed energy tactics and altitude advantage. And Captain Marion Carl, newly promoted after surviving Midway, presented a brutally honest assessment of what had gone wrong. "Gentlemen, we sent Marines to fighting garbage," Carl said, according to the classified conference notes that were declassified in 1972. The F2A Buffalo is not a fighter aircraft. It is a training aircraft that someone mistakenly sent to combat. Every pilot in VMF 221 knew this. Every maintenance officer knew this. Every squadron commander who ever flew it knew this. Yet we deployed it to the most critical outpost in the Pacific and expected it to stop the best pilots flying the best fighters that Japan could field. The result was predictable and predicted. 13 men died. Not because they lacked courage, not because they lacked skill, but because we gave them tools that were inadequate for the job and then ordered them to do it anyway. Every one of those deaths is on us, on this institution, on the procurement system, on the leadership that valued contracts over capability and politics over performance. If we don't fix this, if we don't ensure that our pilots have equipment at least equal to what they're facing, then we're going to see more midways, more massacres, more young men dying in obsolete aircraft while better equipment sits in factories or gets sent to lower priority theatres. I'm not here to complain about the Buffalo. It's gone. Good riddance. I'm here to make sure we never do this again, that we never again send men to fight in aircraft we know are inferior, that we never again sacrifice lives to protect procurement contracts or political relationships. The men of VMF 221 bought us lessons with their blood. We owe them the respect of learning those lessons. The conference resulted in immediate policy changes. Fighter aircraft procurement was accelerated. The Hellcat program was given top priority. Quality control standards were increased across all contractors. Pilot training was extended and improved. Combat reports were systematically analysed and distributed to training commands. And the Buffalo was formally removed from combat status everywhere. By September 1942, not a single F2A remained in a frontline squadron. But the Buffalo's legacy extended beyond American service. The aircraft that Finnish pilots had loved and used so effectively was essentially a different machine. The Brewster Model 239, the export version Finland received, was based on the F2A1 airframe. It weighed 4,700 pounds loaded compared to the F2A3's 7,200 pounds. It was 30 miles per hour faster, climbed 50% better, and handled beautifully. Finnish ace Hans Wind, who achieved 39 of his 75 victories in the Brewster, later wrote about the difference. The American F2A3 and our Model 239 were different aircraft that happened to look similar. Ours was light, fast, and agile, a pilot's aircraft that rewarded skill. The American version was heavy, slow, and clumsy. They took a good design and ruined it by adding weight without adding power. Then they built it poorly. It's no wonder it failed. Wind's assessment was shared by other Finnish pilots. They had flown against Soviet I-16s and early Yaks and found the Brewster superior. But they also noted that by 1943, as more modern Soviet fighters appeared, the Brewster's advantages disappeared. Against the Yak-9 and LA-5, the Brewster was outclassed. Finland began replacing them with German Messerschmitt Bf-109Gs as soon as they became available. The British and Commonwealth experience with the Buffalo paralleled the American disaster. In December 1941, when Japan attacked Malaya, RAF and RAF squadrons equipped with Buffaloes were massacred. Against Japanese Army Ki-43 Oscars and Navy Zeros, the Buffalo proved completely inadequate. Squadron leader Frank Howell, commanding 243 Squadron RAF equipped with Buffaloes, filed a report after his squadron was effectively destroyed in 2 weeks of combat. The Buffalo is outclassed in every respect. It cannot outrun Japanese fighters. It cannot outclimb them. It cannot outturn them. Our only advantage is diving speed, which is useful only for running away. Against Army Oscars, which are even more manoeuvrable than Zeros, we have no effective tactic. I have lost 14 aircraft in combat and 3 to accidents in 2 weeks. Of the 18 Buffaloes we began with, only 1 remains flyable. We have achieved 3 confirmed kills at the cost of 14 pilots dead or missing and 3 wounded. This ratio is unsustainable. Immediate withdrawal and re-equipment with Hurricanes or Spitfires is essential. The British had no choice. Singapore fell in February 1942. The remaining Buffaloes were destroyed to prevent capture. When the British Eastern Fleet retreated to Ceylon in March 1942, not a single Buffalo remained in combat service. The Dutch East Indies Air Force also flew Buffaloes, receiving 72 aircraft in late 1941. They too found them inadequate against Japanese fighters. In the 3-month defence of the Dutch East Indies, Dutch Buffalo squadrons were systematically destroyed. By March 1942, when the Dutch colonial government capitulated, only 2 Buffaloes remained flyable. Both were destroyed by their crews to prevent capture. The global verdict on the F2A Buffalo was unanimous. It was obsolete, inadequate and deadly to fly in combat against modern opposition. Yet the aircraft that should never have reached production had been built in hundreds, deployed to critical theatres and flown by pilots who deserved better. The fundamental question remained unanswered. How had this happened? How had a major military power deployed an obsolete fighter to its most critical bases at the start of a war? The answer lay in the intersection of industrial corruption, bureaucratic inertia, institutional racism, and the brutal pace of technological change in the late 1930s and early 1940s. The Buffalo had been a good design in 1938, but aviation technology was advancing so rapidly that a 4-year development and production timeline guaranteed obsolescence. What was cutting edge in 1938 was obsolete by 1942. The Navy's procurement system, designed for the slow pace of peacetime development, could not adapt to wartime urgency. Brewster's corruption and incompetence turned a marginal situation into a disaster. Had the F2A been built to specification with proper quality control, it would still have been inferior to the Zero, but it might have been competitive. Properly built Buffaloes might have achieved 340 miles per hour instead of 321, might have climbed at 2,800 feet per minute instead of 200, might have been responsive and pleasant to fly instead of sluggish and dangerous. These improvements would not have changed the fundamental performance gap, but they might have reduced losses. Some pilots might have survived who didn't. But this is speculation. The Buffaloes that flew at Midway were poorly built, overweight, underpowered and obsolete. The men who flew them knew this and flew anyway. That courage deserves remembrance. The institutional failures that made their sacrifice necessary deserve condemnation. In 1987, the Marine Corps Aviation Association held a reunion of Midway veterans. 5 surviving pilots from VMF 221 attended, including Marion Carl and Charles Summers. They were in their 70s now, grey-haired and soft-spoken, but they remembered. A journalist covering the reunion asked Summers, who had landed his shot-up Buffalo on Midway's runway, what he thought about when he saw restored Buffaloes at air shows. "I think about the men who didn't come back," Summers said. "I think about George Toms, 22 years old, shot down in the first 2 minutes. I think about Floyd Parks, our squadron commander, shot down within sight of the runway. I think about Bill Brooks and his letter to his parents. I think about all of them, good men, brave men who died in aircraft that never should have been in combat. And I think about the system that put them there. We've learned since then. We build better aircraft now. We train pilots better. We don't underestimate our enemies. But those lessons cost 13 lives just from my squadron. More from other squadrons that flew Buffaloes. That's a high price for education. I just hope we remember, hope we never forget that equipment matters, that you can't substitute courage for capability, that sending men to fight with inadequate tools is murder, regardless of the flag you do it under." The technical analysis of why the Buffalo failed so completely at Midway extends beyond simple performance comparisons. The Zero's advantages were multiplicative, not additive. It wasn't just faster or more manoeuvrable. It was faster and more manoeuvrable and better armed and flown by more experienced pilots. The Zero's armament combined the best of both worlds. The 2 7.7mm machine guns provided high rate of fire with plentiful ammunition for ranging shots and sustained fire. The 220mm cannon provided knockout power. Japanese pilots would typically use machine gun fire to line up their attack, then trigger the cannon for the killing burst. This technique conserved the limited cannon ammunition while maximizing effectiveness. The Buffalo's 4 50 caliber machine guns were, in theory, adequate. The 50 caliber Browning M2 was an excellent weapon. High muzzle velocity, good ballistics, sufficient hitting power to damage or destroy fighters with solid hits. But the Buffalo's installation had problems. The guns were mounted in the wings, far from the aircraft centerline. Convergence was set at 300 yards, meaning all 4 guns' trajectories intersected at that range. Closer or farther, and the spread pattern reduced effectiveness. Additionally, the ammunition capacity of only 200 rounds per gun meant sustained fire was impossible. At the gun's combined rate of fire of 3,200 rounds per minute, a pilot could fire for less than 4 seconds before running dry. Most critically, the Buffalo's limited performance meant getting into firing position was extremely difficult. The Zero could turn inside the Buffalo's turning circle, could climb away if the Buffalo tried to engage from below, could extend away in level flight if the pilot was patient. The Buffalo pilot had to catch the Zero in a moment of vulnerability, get into position, and make the shot count. Against experienced Japanese pilots, this almost never happened. The psychological dimension of the Midway engagement cannot be ignored. The American pilots knew they were outmatched. They had received intelligence briefs on the Zero. They had talked to pilots who had fought in the Philippines and Java. They knew what was coming. This knowledge created a psychological burden that affected performance. Second Lieutenant Charles Hughes, one of the Wildcat pilots who survived, later described the feeling. "We knew before we took off that we were probably going to die, the Buffaloes especially. They were flying death traps against the best fighters in the world, but there was never any question of not going. You didn't talk about it. You didn't discuss the odds. You just strapped in and went. Maybe that was foolish. Maybe that was courage. Probably it was both. But what else were we going to do? Let the Japanese bomb Midway unopposed? We were all that stood between them and the island. So we went." This fatalism affected tactics. Some pilots, knowing they couldn't win, decided to make their deaths count. They rammed damaged aircraft into Japanese bombers. They pressed attacks beyond any reasonable hope of survival. They took suicidal chances because the alternative was dying without achieving anything. Major Park's final attack, pressing on with a dying engine trying to line up one last shot, exemplified this mindset. He knew he was going to die. He chose to die fighting rather than die running. Courage or foolishness? The answer depends on your values. But it was definitely tragedy. The Japanese perspective on the engagement was recorded in post-war interviews with surviving Zero pilots. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya, who led the Zero escort, was interviewed in 1952 for a Japanese military history project. His comments were translated and included in the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey's analysis of Pacific air combat. The American fighters over Midway were brave but ineffective, Itaya said. They attacked aggressively, but their aircraft could not execute their tactics. Several times I saw American pilots attempt maneuvers that would have been effective if their aircraft had the performance to complete them. But the Buffalo was too slow, too heavy. The American pilots would begin a diving attack or a climbing zoom, and we could simply turn inside them or climb with them. It was like fighting children. They had the will, but not the means. I felt no satisfaction in shooting them down. They were victims of poor equipment. Any pilot in such an aircraft would have died the same way. After the battle, we discussed the American fighters. We agreed that the Grumman, the one with the retractable gear, was more dangerous. Several of my pilots had been hit by the Grumman, and their aircraft was damaged but flyable. The Grumman could absorb punishment. The Brewster could not. One good burst and it came apart. I shot down 2 Buffaloes at Midway. Both times the aircraft disintegrated under fire, not shot down, destroyed. Later in the war, when I fought against Hellcats and Corsairs, I understood what American industry was capable of. But at Midway they sent their pilots to fight an obsolete aircraft. This was a mistake that cost them many lives. The operational history of the Buffalo ended at Midway, but the procurement disaster it represented continued to echo through the war. The Navy's response was comprehensive and effective. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, which entered service in 1943, was designed with explicit attention to the lessons learned from Buffalo and early Wildcat combat against Zeros. The Hellcat was not as maneuverable as the Zero. It could not match the Zero's climb rate at low altitude, but it was faster, much more rugged, better armed, and built to standards that ensured reliability. Most importantly, it was produced in massive numbers with consistent quality. Grumman delivered over 12,000 Hellcats during the war. Quality control was excellent. Defect rates were low. Pilots trusted their aircraft. The Hellcat achieved a 19-to-1 kill ratio against Japanese aircraft, the best of any American fighter in the Pacific. This success was built on the lessons learned from the Buffalo's failure. The Vought F4U Corsair, which also entered service in 1943, took a different approach. It was designed for pure performance, with a massive 2,000 horsepower engine and innovative inverted gull-wing design. It was faster than the Zero, climbed better than the Zero, and with proper tactics could outfight the Zero. It too was produced in massive numbers, over 12,000 aircraft with excellent quality control. By 1944, the performance gap had reversed. American fighters were superior to Japanese fighters in every measurable parameter. American pilots were better trained. American tactics were better developed. The slaughter of VMF 221 at Midway would not be repeated because the fundamental failures that caused it had been identified and corrected. But correction came too late for the 13 Marines who died on June 4, 1942. Too late for the RAF and RAF pilots who died over Singapore and Malaya. Too late for the Dutch pilots who died over Java. The Buffalo's casualty list extended beyond those killed in combat. Training accidents killed at least 30 American pilots, possibly more. Records are incomplete. Many accidents were attributed to pilot error, but investigation revealed mechanical failure or structural deficiency. The Buffalo killed its own pilots even when no enemy was present. In 1943, after the Buffalo was withdrawn from frontline service, the Navy convened a board to investigate the entire Buffalo program. The classified report, declassified in 1985, was scathing. It concluded that Brewster Aeronautical had engaged in systematic fraud, that Navy oversight had been negligent, that quality control had been non-existent, and that the decision to deploy the F2A3 to Midway with full knowledge of its inadequacy bordered on criminal negligence. Recommendations included criminal prosecution of Brewster executives, disciplinary action against Navy procurement officers, complete revision of aircraft acceptance procedures, and formal apology to the families of pilots killed in Buffalo operations. The prosecutions went forward. Several Brewster executives were convicted of fraud and served prison time. The procurement reforms were implemented and remain in effect today, but the formal apology never came. The Navy's position was that apologizing would imply responsibility, which would open the service to lawsuits, so the families never received official acknowledgement that their loved ones had been failed by the institution they served. The restored Buffaloes that appear at air shows today are typically the Finnish model 239 variant or heavily modified F2A1s. They are beautiful aircraft, lovingly maintained, flown by skilled pilots at air shows where they perform graceful aerobatics for appreciative crowds. They are also lies, not intentional lies, but lies nonetheless. They present the Buffalo as it could have been, not as it was. The F2A3 that fought at Midway, overweight and underpowered, poorly built and inadequately maintained, would never perform the graceful loops and rolls that air show Buffaloes execute. It would lumber through the sky, heavy and reluctant, a dying aircraft even before enemy fire touched it. The airshow crowds cheer the restored Buffaloes. They should instead remember the men who died in the real ones. The Midway Memorial on Eastern Island, one of the atolls that comprise Midway Atoll, includes a plaque listing the members of VMF 221 killed on June 4, 1942. 13 names, 13 young men who never came home. The plaque includes a quote from Major Floyd Parks, taken from a letter he wrote to his wife 3 weeks before the battle. "We will do our duty with the equipment we have. We cannot choose our circumstances. We can only choose how we respond to them. If the time comes, we will fight with everything we have. If that is not enough, at least we will have tried. That is all anyone can ask." It was not all anyone could ask. They could have asked for equipment adequate to the task. They could have asked for aircraft that gave them a fighting chance. They could have asked that courage not be wasted through negligence and corruption, but they didn't get to ask. They got Buffaloes, and they died. The final word should belong to the pilots who survived. Captain Marion Carl rose to the rank of Major General. He became the Marine Corps' first ace, shooting down 18.5 Japanese aircraft during the war. He was awarded the Navy Cross twice. He became a test, pilot after the war, flying experimental aircraft and breaking speed records. He lived to be 82, dying in 1998. Before his death, he gave an extended interview to the Marine Corps Historical Center about his experiences at Midway. His final comments about the Buffalo were recorded and are available in the Marine Corps archives. I've been asked many times what I think about the Buffalo. People expect me to curse it, to call it the worst aircraft ever built. I won't do that. The Buffalo was what it was, a promising design ruined by bad production and worse procurement. But the real crime wasn't the aircraft. The real crime was sending men to fight in it knowing it was inadequate. We knew the Zero was superior. Intelligence had told us. Test pilots had warned us. But we sent Marines to Midway and Buffaloes anyway because there was nothing else, and someone had to be there. I watched 13 men die in 20 minutes. Good men, brave men, men who deserved better. They didn't die because they lacked courage or skill. They died because we failed them. That failure is written in blood in the sky over Midway. Every person involved in aircraft procurement should be required to visit that memorial and read those names and understand what happens when you prioritize contracts over capability, when you value politics over performance, when you send men to fight with inadequate tools. The Buffalo didn't fail at Midway. We failed the men who flew them. That is the truth. That is the lesson, and if we ever forget it, we deserve to repeat it. The day the Brewster Buffalo met the Zero over Midway, it disintegrated. But it didn't disintegrate because it was poorly designed, or because the pilots lacked skill. It disintegrated because an industrial and military system had failed in its most fundamental duty, to provide warriors with adequate weapons. That failure killed 13 Marines on June 4, 1942. Their memory demands that we never forget why they died. Not in glorious combat against impossible odds, but in preventable tragedy against an enemy they should never have faced in aircraft they should never have flown. That is the true story of the Brewster Buffalo at Midway. Remember it, learn from it, and never repeat it.